Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be heading back in time, way back to ancient Judah, a time of kings and prophets and a really dramatic rediscovery that really kind of shook a nation to its core. We're going to be looking at this story through a couple of different sources. We have 2 Chronicles, 34:1 to 2, and then we jump to verses 8 through 28.
Okay.
And then we'll also be looking at 2 Kings 22:1 through 20. So get ready. We're going to be meeting King Josiah, discovering a lost book, and really trying to unpack this prophecy that really just changed everything.
You know, one of the things that's always fascinated me about this whole story is how it kind of brings together all these different themes, like faith and leadership and the weight of history. And, these events might seem isolated when you first read about them, but when you step back, you start to see how they fit into a much bigger story. It's a story about choices and about the consequences, the ripple effects that come from the choices that we make.
Yeah, and the choices that the leaders of nations make, right? I mean, really big choices that affect a lot of people.
Exactly.
So let's start by meeting King Josiah. The sources tell us that he became king when he was only 8 years old.
8 years old, can you imagine?
Can you imagine? I mean, that's unbelievable. Like, what kind of responsibility? What do we know about him? I mean, what do we know about this little kid who's now king and the kind of leader that he turns out to be?
Yeah, well, it really is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, think about it. To ascend to the throne at such a young age.
Yeah.
Both Chronicles and Kings, they really emphasize that Josiah did what was right in the sight of the Lord, which I think suggests that from a very young age, he was actively trying to lead with this sense of justice, to align his actions with his faith. He wanted to do what was right.
So it sounds like he was trying to be, more than just a king, like he was actually trying to be a good king. And of course, he has this very significant ancestor to look up to, right? I mean, King David.
Right, King David.
How does David's legacy kind of play into all of this? I mean, was David considered a good king, from their perspective back then?
That's a very complex question, right? Because David's legacy is so multifaceted. On the one hand, he's revered. I mean, he's revered for uniting the tribes, for establishing Jerusalem as their capital, and of course for all of his incredible contributions to their sacred writings, the Psalms. And at the same time, his reign was also marked by a lot of internal conflicts and some pretty serious personal failings as well.
So even the, quote-unquote great kings, even they had their complexities and their struggles. It really makes you think about what good leadership actually means, doesn't it?
It really does. And it really highlights this idea that there's this constant struggle to live up to these ideals that we have, even for the people who are in these positions of power.
Yeah. So the story takes this really interesting turn, I think, in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, when he decides to initiate this major renovation of the temple. What prompted this sudden interest in restoration? What do you think was going on there?
Well, if you look at this through the lens of all of Josiah's overall religious reforms, it's possible to see this temple renovation as kind of this very symbolic act,
Yeah.
Maybe he saw the condition of the temple as reflecting this kind of deeper spiritual neglect within the nation. And he thought that by restoring this physical structure, he could address some of that spiritual neglect. He wanted to revitalize their faith.
So he's revitalizing the physical to maybe try and revitalize the spiritual as well.
Okay.
That's really interesting. And, the sources, they kind of go into the details, the logistics of how this renovation took place, gathering the funds, appointing workers. And there's this interesting little detail that there was no reckoning made with the money. Like, nobody was keeping track of the money. They had that much trust in each other. Can you tell us a little bit about the financial practices back then? What was going on there?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, of course, without more information. But the fact that there isn't this kind of meticulous accounting might indicate that they placed a greater emphasis on communal responsibility. They weren't so concerned with keeping track of every penny because people were contributing out of a genuine desire to support this project that they believed in.
Yeah.
They believed in the temple's significance. They weren't just doing it because they were afraid of getting in trouble.
That speaks volumes, I think, about that sense of shared purpose. But it's during this renovation that something really extraordinary happens. Hilkiah, the high priest, he finds the Book of the Law in the temple. And I think it's important to emphasize that this wasn't just, misplacing a scroll and finding it later.
No.
This was a monumental discovery, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this Book of the Law, as it's referred to, scholars believe that it contained all these core teachings, all these commandments that really form the foundation of their entire faith and legal system. To have it found suggests that it had been, lost, neglected, perhaps even for generations. Imagine rediscovering a document that held the key to your entire belief system. That's huge.
It's got to be just like mind-blowing, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the way the discovery is described in the text is so interesting because it's like, Hilkiah finds it and then he tells Shaphan and then Shaphan brings it to Josiah. And it builds all this suspense, as you're reading it. And then we get to Josiah's reaction and he doesn't just like express concern. He tears his clothes when he hears what's written in this book. So what does that tell us? What kind of response is that? I mean, that's huge. That's a very, very big deal. Tearing one's clothes back then, that was a very powerful cultural expression. It was an expression of grief and distress and repentance. So it really shows us just how deeply he was impacted by the words in this book. Here he was, striving to be this righteous leader, and all of a sudden he's confronted with this possibility, this very real possibility, that he and his entire nation, that they had strayed so far from the path that they were supposed to be on.
So he's not just facing like a historical document or a legal document. He's facing like this mirror and it's reflecting their spiritual state and it's not pretty.
Exactly. And it's because of all this turmoil, it's in this moment of turmoil that he decides to seek out some guidance. And that's what leads him to the prophetess Huldah.
And that is where we are going to pick things up in part 2. Okay, so we left off with King Josiah, and he is reeling from this rediscovery of the Book of the Law. This document has shaken him to his very core, and he knows he needs guidance, he needs answers, and so he decides to turn to Huldah, a prophetess. So tell us a little bit more about her. Who was she, and why would Josiah the king, why would he seek out her counsel in this moment of crisis?
Well, prophets held this very unique position in ancient Israelite society. They were believed to be these conduits of divine messages, individuals who could interpret the will of God and really offer guidance based on that. And Huldah, her prominence, it really suggests that she was deeply respected for her spiritual insight and her wisdom. It's really significant that Josiah the king would seek her out in this moment. It really tells us how important prophetic voices were in their culture.
And it's interesting because the text mentions that they find Huldah in the college, which is kind of intriguing. What can you tell us about that? What was this college? Like, what kind of institution are we talking about here?
Unfortunately, the sources don't give us a lot of details, but, it's really fascinating to think about what this college might have been. Some scholars think it could have been a place of learning that was connected to the temple itself. Maybe a scribal school or a center for religious instruction. But whatever it was, it does tell us that there was this idea of structured education, this transmission of knowledge, even way back then.
So you have Josiah's delegation. They arrive at this college, and they're carrying the weight of this rediscovered book and all of the king's anxiety. They lay it all out for Huldah and her prophecy. I mean, it's not exactly what they were hoping to hear, is it?
No, not really. She basically confirms all of Josiah's fears. She prophesies that God's wrath is upon the nation because of their unfaithfulness, their idolatry, and because they've neglected these very laws that they've just rediscovered. It's a stark reminder, I think, that actions have consequences and that when you stray from your core values, you can end up facing a reckoning.
So Josiah hears that his nation, the nation that he's trying to lead righteously, that this nation is now facing judgment. It must have been just devastating for him to hear that. But there is a little glimmer of hope in there, right? Like Huldah's prophecy, there's something specific for Josiah in there.
This is where it gets really interesting because even though she's delivering this message of national judgment, she also acknowledges Josiah's sincere remorse, his humility in the face of all of this. And she gives him this personal message of hope. She says that because he has repented, because his repentance is genuine, Josiah will die in peace. He won't have to witness the full weight of the judgment that's coming.
Wow. So even in this really, really big, sweeping prophecy of national judgment, there's this acknowledgement of individual righteousness. That must have been a really powerful moment for Josiah.
Absolutely. And I think it really highlights the complexity of divine justice, doesn't it? It acknowledges that there's this collective responsibility, but it also affirms that our individual choices, they really do matter. Repentance, a change of heart, it can actually make a difference.
It makes you think about, that balance, right, between the choices that we make as individuals and then all these bigger things that are happening around us that we can't control. What do you think? Like, what was going through Josiah's mind in that moment?
Oh, I can only imagine. I mean, he must have felt such a mix of emotions. On the one hand, relief for himself, but on the other hand, this heavy burden knowing what was coming for his people. It raises a really interesting question for all of us, though, doesn't it? Does knowing the consequences of our actions, whether they're good or bad, does that actually change how we live, how we choose to live our lives?
I mean, that's a question we all struggle with in some way, right? I mean, if we knew what the outcome was going to be, would we make different choices? Would we be more intentional, more aware of how our actions affect other people? It's something worth thinking about for sure.
Definitely. And I think that's what makes these ancient texts so powerful. They're not just historical accounts, they're opportunities for us to really explore what it means to be human, to wrestle with our faith and the choices that we make in the face of all this uncertainty.
And it's even more powerful because we're seeing it through the story of a real person, a young king who's dealing with this enormous responsibility and now this profound prophecy.
Right. And for Josiah, this is just the beginning. The sources that we're looking at for this deep dive, they kind of end abruptly here. But I think they've given us this glimpse into a really pivotal moment in his life, a moment that will undoubtedly shape everything that he does moving forward.
It really leaves you with this feeling of what happens next,
Yeah.
How will Josiah lead his nation now, knowing that this judgment is coming? Will he be able to change things? Can he make a difference? I guess those are questions we'll have to explore as we delve into part 3 of our deep dive. So we've traveled all the way back to ancient Judah, met this incredible young King Josiah, and we've seen how just utterly shaken he was by rediscovering that book of the law. He seeks guidance, goes to the prophetess Huldah, and what she tells him is not exactly good news. Judgment is coming for the nation. But there is that little glimmer of hope for Josiah himself.
Right.
And the sources that we've been looking at for this deep dive, they kind of leave us hanging there, don't they? But it's given us a lot to think about. It's a powerful moment to just kind of sit with for a minute.
It is. It really makes you think about leadership in a whole new way. Like, how do you lead when you know things are going to get tough, really tough? How do you reconcile this idea that you personally might be spared from the worst of it, but that everyone else around you is still going to suffer?
I mean, I think that's something that we can all relate to in some way, even though we're, thousands of years removed from this story. So we're left to imagine what Josiah did after hearing all of this. How did he handle that prophecy? Did it change his approach to leadership?
Well, the sources we've been looking at end here. But if we look at the full biblical account, it actually shows us that Josiah, he didn't just sit back and accept what Huldah told him. He takes action. He starts initiating all of these religious reforms, trying to get the nation to rededicate themselves to the covenant that was outlined in that book that they found, the book of the law. He really tries to lead the people in this renewal of faith, almost like he's trying to change their course to maybe somehow soften the blow of the judgment that's coming.
So instead of retreating and just focusing on his own, personal peace and safety, he actually uses his position to try to inspire his people to do better, to be better. That says a lot about his character.
It really does.
Yeah.
I think it reminds us that real leadership isn't about power. It's not even really about authority. It's about responsibility, about taking action, about doing the right thing, even when it's hard.
Yeah. And even when it might not change the outcome.
Exactly.
It makes you think about the kinds of leaders that we look up to today. The ones who don't shy away from challenges, who keep trying to make a difference, to inspire positive change, even when things seem impossible.
Absolutely. And Josiah's story, even though it happened so long ago, it really speaks to all of us, doesn't it? It's about courage and conviction and the power that we have as individuals to make a difference, even when it seems like there's no hope.
So it kind of challenges us to look at our own lives and ask ourselves, how are we responding to the challenges that we're facing? Are we just sitting back and letting things happen, or are we actively trying to make things better, both for ourselves and for the people around us?
I think that's a question we should all be asking ourselves. And it all goes back to that idea of rediscovering lost wisdom. Whether it's an ancient text, like in Josiah's case, or maybe just a forgotten value that we used to hold dear.
Right.
Makes you wonder, what would happen if we all took some time to just re-examine our core beliefs, our values, the things that guide our actions? What lost books might we find within ourselves? And what kind of transformation, personal or collective, might come out of that?
I love that. That's such a great thought to end on. So our deep dive into the story of King Josiah, the lost book, and a nation standing on the brink of judgment, it might be over. But the journey of self-discovery, that never really ends. The pursuit of wisdom, that's something we should all be striving for.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration. I hope you learned something new.
And to all of you listening out there, we encourage you to keep searching, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Until next time.